Welcome back, folks, and today we are going to jump into the Enlightenment structure for each of the 9 Enneagram types. Now, if you have not watched my previous video on the shadow structure, you would want to probably watch that one first because it covers the fundamentals that you're going to need to understand this lesson. But I will recap some of the key points if it's been a while or maybe some of that stuff went over your head. And this is very technical work, so heads up, it's not easy, but it's very important. And I'm really excited to bring this new model to you because I've been working on this for about 5 years to help better understand how and why the Enneagram works. And to do that and really build into it the spiritual dimension of the Enneagram so that we can reach that sort of elusive state of awakening, enlightenment, or your highest self. How do you live out your highest virtues and be your best self in everything you do, but also in how you relate to money? So we're going to get to the money masters finally and into some depth with that. And of course, I'm going to do a separate video for each of the 9 types later on. We'll go really in depth, but this is going to give you a quick overview. And also, if you enjoy these videos, please remember to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. That would be a huge personal favor to help me keep this work going. And as always, if you need help determining your Enneagram type, there's a barcode link to the IEQ9 Integrative Enneagram Test, which is the most, in my opinion, the most scientifically rigorous and accurate test available. It costs a bit of money, of course, but most of the free tests out there, you kind of get what you pay for. You'll maybe get a 50, 60% accuracy rate, but with the IEQ9, you can get a 95% accuracy rate and understand your instinctual variance as well. So check that out. All right, so this work that we're going to cover is the kind of the core concepts of my new book, Taming Your Money Monsters, 9 Paths to Money Mastery with the Enneagram. Pre-orders are available on Amazon. It comes out July 8th, 2025. So please, if you enjoy this, I think you're going to really enjoy the book. The feedback I've gotten on it so far is quite excellent. But this is really kind of the meat and potatoes of the Enneagram. And what we're going to look at is what I call the falling upward, or the Double Cone Enneagram. And I've named this in honor of Richard Rohr, who wrote a book called Falling Upward. And I'm really synthesizing many of his core ideas there and bringing them into conjunction with the Enneagram. So let's look at the overview of this Double Cone Enneagram, what this looks like. So here's a picture for you. And as we talked about in the last video, we're starting at the bottom. We built out the bottom half of this double cone in that shadow structure video. And the point of the shadow, right, is it causes your ego to grow, which is actually a good thing. Without it, we wouldn't be able to function in the world. And so we're starting in the womb, excuse me, allergies here. And as you move up into what we call the first half of life, then your ego sort of expands. It's all about you. It's about establishing your independence, and then really being able to, like, your career, family, of course, spouses, romantic partners, all the things that make you feel good about being me. But the problem, of course, is that over time, and it's a sort of a necessary growth process, our ego grows to such it inflates to the point where we start to push everything and everything else away. And we'll get into the dark night of the soul in another video. That really requires a much more in-depth analysis. But essentially, we kind of fall into this. Our ego addictions, as we covered previously, can really get us into trouble. And we overuse them, or we hit a crisis, and then they essentially, like a blowfish, we puff up our ego, and then everything, including our sense of connection to the divine, our sense of the sacred, whatever that is for you, feels missing, feels lacking. It's quite a difficult point to be in. But if we can break open in that dark night, we move up into the Enlightenment structure, where the ego begins to recede, and we start to move into this path of awakening. So this is the quick outline of the Double Cone Enneagram. And now let's look at it with a little bit more detail. So here we are. We've got the shadow structure here on the bottom. We covered that previously. This is really what we might call the false self. And it's not bad. I'm not trying to put it, but it's something we need to mature out of if we want to enter into, elderhood, or if we want to move into a wisdom phase of our lives, and we really want to grow spiritually, we have to overcome our shadow, and we have to move into that enlightenment phase structure. And that's where our true self, or our highest self, our best self, begins to emerge. And we can start approaching, even just briefly, often fleetingly, for me, that's for sure, we can touch on that pinnacle point of awakening, where we feel our interconnection with everyone and everything else, especially the divine. So that first half of life, let's look at the other side of this. That's our path to independence, right? So we have to separate egoically from the emotional egoic codependence we have on our caregivers. We have to cut that psychological umbilical cord with the sacred wound, which we talked about, and that begins to build the shadow structure, or the false self. And we're moving in that bottom half, what I call from thee to me. Thee being whatever you want to call that sacred spark that allows us to have consciousness. I'm not putting any theology on this. That's up to you, but I call it, you could call it the ground of all being. You could call it, the source. You could call it source. I call it God, because that's just the easiest shorthand term I can use for it. But again, I'm not laying any theology on that. That's up to you to determine what that means for you. And then we move into the second half of life, and now we begin to build our interdependence, right? And it's the movement from me to we, from my egoic sort of false self, always thinking about what I want, what I need, me, which is, again, it's a necessary part of survival. Without that, we wouldn't be able to function in the world. But there's a healthier way to move forward into that interdependence with others, where we take care of ourselves and our family and our community and the wider world. We have a responsibility, as this is a sort of a reference to Dostoevsky and the brothers Karamazov, where we sort of understand that we're responsible before all and for all, that no one else is more responsible for the world around us than you or I. And it's kind of, in using some Christian metaphors from my tradition, it's like you pick up your cross, right? You pick up the cross, and again, no theology, you're not trying to preach here. I'm just using symbolisms from my tradition, because it's the only one I can speak from with authenticity. But then you take responsibility for the world, for the suffering around you. And that's the point of becoming a money master, is that you have more tools in your superhero utility tool belt to heal the pain and suffering around you, and the sort of the crack that you were born to fix. And when you can move into that enlightenment structure, it becomes much easier. You're much more in tune with the virtues that you need to practice for your Enneagram type, and really develop your spiritual growth and path. All right, so that's a quick outline of the Double Cone Enneagram. And now let's look at the enlightenment structure, so which we covered again the shadow structure previously. And this is just a little bit technical, and it'll make more sense when we put it into practice in just a moment. So we have, in order for us to move into the enlightenment structure, we have a primary recovery virtue that we need to embody and inhabit. And you'll see now, hopefully, why I've changed so much of the terminology from the traditional Enneagram nomenclature, because this allows the terms in the shadow structure and the enlightenment structure that I've developed based on a Jungian understanding of the shadow and the ego. It allows them to mirror each other. And so you see how we have a primary recovery virtue, but that is sort of the antithesis of the primary ego addiction in the shadow. So our primary ego addiction, again, is the kind of our go-to default way of navigating reality. And then we need to practice that recovery virtue, but then it opens up a secondary recovery virtue. And so we need both of those to reach our greatest virtue. So they're kind of like we have these two secondary virtues, and they combine to create a superpower. This is your greatest strength in a way. And then when you can embody your greatest virtue, then you start to fulfill your greatest hope, which is the opposite of your greatest fear. So you start to overcome your greatest fear with your greatest hope by practicing your greatest virtue. And then, sort of the thing that you've always longed for from your childhood, the very thing that you've been most scared of or afraid of, it flips and it becomes the source of your greatest fulfillment. And that allows what I call your sacred gift to manifest more fully, which is a revision of the holy ideas. Okay, so that's just a quick outline of the enlightenment structure. You can see it in parallel to the shadow structure. It's worth just kind of sitting with this graph for a few minutes and kind of absorbing it and looking at it. But we'll again, let's jump into each of the 9 Enneagram types, look at the enlightenment structure by type. And what I'm going to present to you right now is an ego map for each of the 9 types, which I'm really quite proud of. It's been a long time putting this together. It took a lot of work, had a lot of help, of course, from a lot of good friends. But let's look at the ego map for type 1. So there's another idea I'm going to throw in here. This is a bit of a curveball. It's a new concept. So we're going to start at the bottom of that enlightenment structure with the faux virtue. So the faux virtue is sort of like your spiritual trap door. And it's the thing that feels like a virtue. And for other Enneagram types, it is. But for you, it's a trap. It's a thing that you can latch onto in order to justify some of your worst traits of your Enneagram type. And for type 1, it's honesty. Now, I'm not saying that they shouldn't be honest. What I'm saying is that sometimes when a type 1 is being too honest, it's a bit like being hit with a truth tornado. It's oddly precise, but a bit devastating. Because when a 1 is being maybe too honest, it might mean that they're allowing their resentment and their anger to come forth a little too aggressively. They're prone to this kind of perfectionism and this need to improve themselves, but also improve others or the systems around them. And so that improvement project of other people can cause them to be a little too honest about the flaws that they see, the problems they see in others. And when 1 is getting really honest, everyone kind of develops a sudden urge to be anywhere else. Right. If you can avoid that trap door, then again, we're going to get into the primary recovery virtue for 1, which is gratitude. Now, gratitude is so important because it's good for all types, but that's what's going to help overcome that resentment, their primary ego addiction. And then it's the antidote. It's the opposite of that negative trait. And when they're living more in gratitude and appreciation rather than in resentment, or they're more centered with what is, they're more able to accept things as they are and realize that actually everything's kind of perfect, it's in the way it is in the cosmic sense, that there's, as Julian of Norwich would say, all will be well, and all shall be well. It's a little bit like that. It's this more mystical understanding that everything isn't up to the 1 to fix in this world, and they can be grateful for what they have and for things as they are. Now, when they practice their primary recovery virtue, that opens up their secondary recovery virtue, often called the relaxation point in the Enneagram, traditional Enneagram terminology. And they start to practice mindfulness. So they're adopting what is the primary recovery virtue for type 7, becomes their secondary recovery virtue. And mindfulness is just being in the present moment, is really being grounded and centered in the here and now. And then when they combine mindfulness and gratitude, that creates their super virtue or their greatest virtue, which is serenity. And then that's when the 1 can be peaceful, can be calm. Their anger isn't being triggered all the time. Their resentment isn't showing up all the time. They have this peaceful serenity about them. And then they're able to radiate more love, compassion, and acceptance for what is. And when they do that, it helps unlock their greatest hope. And the greatest hope is to experience their complete goodness, which is the opposite of their greatest fear. So the greatest fear for 1 is being bad, defective, corrupt. But when they're in that serene moment, they're at peace with themselves and they're at peace with the world. And then that brings about their sacred gift, which is sort of the divine community service for 1, is to help see the divine perfection in everyone and in everything and help others to experience that as well. Now, they still have a desire to help improve the world, but they're not doing it any longer from anger or from resentment or frustration. They're just doing it from love and acceptance and to be of service and to heal the crack in the world that they were born to fix. And now, when they achieve a degree of serenity, now they're at a healthier place with themselves, and then they become the money master. I call them the poised. They're no longer the pious or the prude. They're the poised. They're very grounded in their financial life. They've got all their ducks in a row, but they realize that life is not a perfect balance sheet, and things go sideways at times, and they don't get so bent out of shape when the world doesn't conform to their high standards and expectations. So there's the quick ego map for type 1. Okay, let's jump into the Enneagram Type 2, the helper or the ambulance, as I call them. So the faux virtue, we're going to look at the Enlightenment structure here. The faux virtue for a 2 is generosity. Now, generosity is a good virtue to have in all of our types, but for type 2, it can be a real spiritual trap because their generosity tends to have strings attached. They're playing a game of give to get. They're giving in order to get validation, approval, love, and acceptance. And it's really not really selfless at all. It's actually a kind of a selfish type of giving. And when they're giving out of their false self or an unhealthy expression of their type, it can be very damaging to them and also to the people around them. But if we move into the Enlightenment structure, the primary recovery virtue for a type 2 is honesty. Now, honesty for a type 2 means being honest about what they really feel, because honesty is the antidote to their primary ego addiction to flattery. So 2s are always running around telling other people how wonderful they are, being of service, trying to be kind, but it's not really, it's a kind of a form of manipulation, and that's why it's problematic. And so what 2s need to practice is being honest about what they really feel, what they really think, and what they really need, rather than trying to get their needs met in a kind of a covert or roundabout way. They need you to be more direct about what they think and what they feel, so they're not constantly stuck in this approval-seeking, people-pleasing behavior. And when they start practicing honesty, that begins to open up their secondary recovery virtue, which is joy. And that's so they start to look more like a healthy type 4, because joy is the primary recovery virtue for a 4. They don't become a 4. They just sort of have more of those traits as they learn to practice joy and for what's beautiful and wonderful around them in the present moment. And then honesty and joy, those two sort of more secondary virtues, combine to create their super virtue or their highest, greatest virtue, which is humility. So humility is then the antidote to the pride, which is their greatest vice, which is driving all of their unhealthy behavior. And so humility for a 2 is just, again, the combination of joy and honesty. And then that brings about a kind of humility in them that allows them to be grounded and centered and let their true self come forward. And then that fulfills their greatest hope, which is to feel unconditionally loved for who they are, not because of all the acts of service that they're providing or all the compliments they're giving, and all the flattery that they're throwing. Basically, all that flattery, it's really noise. It's kind of it's a bit of a toxic game, and when they can get past that and can really tap into their authentic selves, then people see them and love them for who they truly are, not for this sort of false persona that they're throwing up all the time. And then when they're truly grounded in that humility, it allows their sacred gift to come forth, which is divine love. And what I mean by divine love is unconditional love. So an unhealthy 2 is giving conditional love, and a healthy 2 is giving unconditional love. And they manifest that more than any other type. And therefore, that's why their money master is called the beloved. They really become this beloved figure who's giving and kind and still warm and sweet, but from a place of humility, authenticity, joy, and honesty. And that's really the spiritual path for the type 2, bringing them more into conscious unity with the world. And that's, and moving into that interdependence rather than that selfish independence they're trying to get from their unhealthy shadow structure. Now, moving on to type 3, which is my favorite. I can talk about type 3 all day because, well, I'm a type 3. And now the faux virtue for a type 3 is assertiveness. And that's because 3s are really good about promoting themselves. They're very good at trying to win accolades and please and impress the people around them. So when a 2 is being too assertive, that means, so assertiveness is a virtue for other types, but for 3, it's a bit of a problem because they're usually asserting their false self. They're asserting the persona, the masks that they wear to get people to like them, to approve of them, to say, get the pat in the head and, the gold sticker, to win the trophy, win the race, whatever it is. And those achievements aren't bad in and of themselves, but it's really feeding that vanity, that primary ego addiction of vanity for a type 3. So they need to be mindful of that they aren't using assertiveness as a spiritual trapdoor to really reinforce their vanity and then the deceit that lies behind it. So the real first step for the enlightenment structure for a 3 is to practice their primary recovery virtue, which is modesty. Now, modesty for a 3 is a bit tricky because modesty is about an accurate self-assessment. It doesn't mean, because 3s have this problem where they have this, their sacred wound is internalized sadness or grief or shame about how they perceive themselves, and an externalized sadness or grief and shame about how they think others perceive them. So it isn't humility so much. They're not trying to push their ego down. I mean, you are, but you want to find that middle ground so you don't dive into, you don't trigger that internalized sadness, which will lead to a kind of nihilistic despair. But you don't want to be engaging in too much of that, and you want to temper that the vanity, which will lead to kind of an egoic narcissistic self-aggrandizement. So, to put it more succinctly, they're trying to balance between narcissistic self-aggrandizement and nihilistic despair, and modesty is what puts them in the middle where they're more balanced and have accurately see what their strengths and what their weaknesses are and can present those things authentically to the people that they're encountering with in their daily life. So now modesty opens up their secondary recovery virtue, which is faith. And now faith is not a belief in any particular doctrine or dogma. It's the faith and the trust in the universe to take all the masks off that the 3 is constantly wearing, to stop with all the people-pleasing behavior and really just let their true self shine forth. And when they have the faith to step forward in courage as their true self and modestly do so, that brings about their greatest virtue, their superpower, which is authenticity. So an unhealthy 3, you can tell them by how inauthentic they tend to be. They can often rub people the wrong way and get themselves into all kinds of issues and troubles with that vanity. But when they're engaging in authenticity, that's their highest virtue, and it allows their greatest hope to shine forth, which is to feel completely valued. And that value that true value can only happen when the 3 shows their true self. Without trying, it's like when you're putting up a mask all the time and people praise you for the mask, you know it's fake. And so the praise and compliments just sort of bounce off of you, and they never really assuage that deep inner sense of worthlessness that a 3 has. And that's why it's so important that they begin to practice that authenticity. And when they do that, it opens up their sacred gift, which is divine purpose. 3s are, we're task completers, we're go-getters, all those things. But 3s are really good at bringing about the why. Like why, if a 3 doesn't have a why am I doing this, it's really hard for them to get motivated to do anything. But they bring that sacred why to everything that they do, and they help bring that sacred why to the wider world around them and help other people find their divine purpose. And that really is what their kind of cosmic community service is for the world. And it allows them then to become the money master, which is the builder, meaning they're no longer building monuments to their ego. They're building something in service of a higher good for the community and the world around them. Now, let's take a quick look over here at type 4. And for the type 4, we are going to look at their faux virtue, which is mindfulness. Now, mindfulness practices are good for everyone. They're good for the 4 in terms of meditation and contemplation. I'm not talking about that. But what I mean by it, mindfulness being a spiritual trapdoor for the 4 is it can trigger their envy. Their 4s tend to be too mindful of what everyone else is doing and comparing themselves to others and feeling envious of all the things other people have that they don't have, that they don't feel like they have a unique place in the world. They don't feel like they have a special identity. And so being too concerned about whatever is going on in the people around them can really cause a lot of spiritual problems for the 4. They need to find a grounded center inside themselves that isn't dependent on what the world around them is doing. Because the 4s tend to react. They so much of what the 4 does in life is react against conventionality, react against the expectations or the whatever the sort of the status quo around them is, because they want to feel different. They want to step apart, and that constant need of comparison is what is going to be fueled by excess mindfulness. Now, jumping to the real beginning of their enlightenment structure is joy. So that learning to find joy in the present moment, even if it's just the way the sunlight's coming through your window, or enjoying a nice cup of tea in the morning, or a cat sitting in your lap. Finding some joy in the present moment is what will help overcome their primary ego addiction to melancholy. So 4s are often, they're always buffeted by this sort of bittersweet sadness because they don't feel like they belong or have a place or an identity. And so therefore they need to really tap into finding joy in the small things and then moving up to the bigger things throughout their day and throughout their life, so that they can really conquer that shadow which is causing so much of the suffering for themselves and most importantly, not just for you, but for the people around you. And so it's really imperative for all the Enneagram types to really overcome their shadow. Otherwise, you're taking all that pain and you're not only are you inflicting it on yourself, but you tend to project it out on the world around you. And that's why becoming a money master is so important, because money tends to transmit our trauma. As Richard Rohr, a good friend, often says, if we don't transform our pain, we are destined to transmit it, mostly to the people that we love. And since money is the tool for most actions, then if we're acting out our trauma all the time, and it will inevitably be acted out through our money habits, and that creates all of our money monsters and all the financial struggles we face, whether we're rich, whether we're poor. The amount of money you have isn't really the point. It's how you're using it. And is it you being used for good, or is it being used to sort of project your trauma out into the world? Unconsciously, of course. So for the type 2, now we move into the secondary recovery virtue for them, which is gratitude. Now, gratitude is what is going to anchor them and even further. So helping overcome that melancholy, helping overcome that sense of envy at others, because they're grateful for what they have and they aren't always comparing themselves to the rest of the world and reacting in opposition to whatever is going on around them. It's a kind of, think of it like this for 4. 4s, you're so busy trying to be different and special and unique, and you think the problem is that you're not really developing a unique identity so much as you are developing an identity in opposition to what's going on around you. And that's really a kind of slavery, if you think about it. It's not real freedom to develop yourself. It's a reaction to. So when you can find joy in the present moment, gratitude for the things and the blessings you have in your life, then that moves you up to equanimity. Now, 4s are always buffeted by an onslaught of emotions. So 4s tend to feel emotions much more intensely than any of the other types. And that puts them on this roller coaster of highs and lows, and often lows. And equanimity is what's going to smooth out the ride. you're still going to have hard days. You're still going to have strong emotions, but you're able to have an equanimity, a balance, and be able to kind of pull back and realize that you aren't your feelings all the time. You don't have to like let those feelings drive everything that you do, and get a little bit of distance from them, and then have that calm equipoise, finding that true grounded center in yourself, and seeing that divine spark inside yourself, which is the source of your true uniqueness, is sort of an eternal uniqueness. And when you tap into that inner source rather than an external reaction to the people around you, that's when you fulfill your greatest hope, which is to feel your total uniqueness. And that's when your true self starts to emerge, and your true gifts and all your talents can really shine forth. And then you embody your sacred gift, which is divine glory. And divine glory for a 4 is helping other people see the beauty, the magnificence, the wonder, the awe that surrounds all of us all the time. And that can be through a form of artistic expression. It can be through your work, whatever creative projects you've got going on. But you're bringing all that creativity, all that talent, and all that motivation in service to the world to really bring something special out to others and help others also feel their divine uniqueness and see the glory in themselves and everyone and everything. It's their unique way of expressing that conscious unity. Now, we're all trying to get to that conscious unity point at the top of the Double Cone Enneagram, but each Enneagram type expresses it with a different flavor. And it's sort of, that's the point why we all are. In my system, the way I look at it, you don't have to agree with this, but it's the different ways that the holy, the sacred, that God manifests in us, through us, in us, as us, to really bring love and bring more love into the world. That's the whole point of all of this, is to be more loving, more kind, more compassionate. Now, we'll move into the type 5, the investigator or the compact car, and we're going to look at their faux virtue, which is going to So interesting. The faux virtue for the 5 is gratitude. Well, the 4, of course, needs to practice more gratitude, but the 5, the reason why gratitude is a trap for the 5 is they tend to have this problem with stinginess or avarice, the primary addiction that desire to hold on. Gratitude can feed their worst vice and their primary ego addiction, meaning they're so grateful for what they have, but they're apparently not terribly grateful for the concept of sharing sometimes. They're so busy hoarding their feelings, their ideas, their resources, that they don't tend to give a lot out. So when they're too grateful for what they have, it's a kind of way of reinforcing their need to hoard and withdraw and pull back if they're not careful. Doesn't mean they shouldn't practice gratitude. I'm not saying that at all. Just be mindful that it isn't an excuse to feed your worst tendencies in your shadow structure. So as we move into the real first step of your enlightenment structure, you want to practice your primary recovery virtue, which is generosity, is learning to be a little bit freer with you've got all this stuff in your head. You got all these ideas. You've got all this wealth of knowledge. You've got tremendous gifts to share with the world, both emotionally, spiritually, materially. And can you learn to be more generous with yourself and with others and give a little more out every day? You're never going to be probably a social butterfly. You're probably never going to be the person who wants to be the center of attention all the time. But you do want to sort of practice that generosity, because that's going to overcome your natural stinginess of your primary ego addiction. And then you have a secondary recovery virtue that begins to open up the more you practice your primary recovery virtue. And for a 5, that's mercy. It's learning to be more merciful towards themselves and towards others, so that they can allow that's going to supercharge their generosity. And again, it doesn't mean the 5 has to go and give away all their money and open their bank account and open the floodgates and sort of drain themselves. But they can be a little less rigid in their boundaries, be a little bit more open every day, trying to slowly turn the tide against that avarice and stinginess that is feeding their shadow structure. And then when they can do that, the greatest virtue, generosity plus mercy, brings about their greatest virtue, which is non-attachment, meaning that's the cure for fundamentally the cure for the avarice that is their greatest vice. And they're able to be, again, they're not attached to, like 5, they're so afraid of being helpless and incompetent that if they share too much, it's going to trip them up. People are going to see that they aren't competent. They don't really know what they're talking about, even though they do oftentimes. Or they're going to be afraid that there's this constant feeling of being drained by the world that the 5 has, which is why I call them the compact car, because they have a small gas tank for social interactions most of the time. And when they can practice that non-attachment, they're the ones who really bring divine truth. They have all this. They're the deep thinkers, the deep knowers, the deep explorers of intellectually of the Enneagram. And when they can practice that non-attachment, it allows their greatest hope to be fulfilled, even in small doses, which is to know they are wholly capable and competent. Now, no one's going to know you're capable and competent if you aren't sharing what you know. If you aren't engaging with the world on a deep, fundamental level, you're never going to really get that understanding of just how able you are and overcoming that fear that sort of grips your soul is when you can sort of let go of all that nonsense and not be attached to all of it so much. And then you bring about your sacred gift, which is divine truth. You're really the ones who can bring wisdom, knowledge, and your experience to others to help heal the world. So the great thinkers, people like Albert Einstein, for example, was a type 5. Like, look at all the divine truth he brought through his understanding of physics, and we go down the list. And then when a 5 becomes a money master, I call them the Midas. They've overcome their moot and miser tendencies. And unlike the fable of Midas, which was somewhat negative, I'm using that word for alliteration. But for 5, everything they touch turns to gold. Like they just are fountains of wisdom, of generosity, both on all levels. And they just light up the world with that Midas touch. Okay, so let's jump then into the type 6. We're going to look at the skeptic or the family sedan. The type 6, their faux virtue is modesty, meaning, so what I mean by that is for the 6, they're living in the self-doubt all the time, and it's easy to kind of put themselves down and think they're just being modest when in fact they're being fearful. So modesty for a 6 can reinforce their fear and their cowardice, which is the core piece of the shadow for the 6. So something to be careful of, that you kind of aren't hiding your light under a bushel and saying, well, I don't know. It's being able to step forth in courage, in your true power, in your true confidence, to be able to bring for yourself the security and the safety that you've been looking for, rather than always seeking it from others. Now, the primary recovery virtue for a type 6 is then going to be faith. Again, like a type 3, this is not a faith based on doctrine or dogma. It's sort of a trust in the cosmic benevolence of the universe, that there's something greater than themselves that is kind of got their back, and that it's internal, that they have the faith and trust that they don't need to be on constant hyper-vigilant mode all the time. And they can have faith in their own abilities, faith in their own competency, and that they aren't going to need to look for that security outside themselves at all times, or too much of the time. And then we move into their secondary recovery virtue for a 6, which is assertiveness, meaning they can stand up for themselves, voice their opinions, know who they are, know what they want, and go out there and make it happen for themselves. And then faith plus assertiveness is what brings about their greatest virtue, which is courage. And courage, when they embody it, is what will heal their greatest vice, which is cowardice. So you can see the parallel structure here that we've built out. And when a 6 becomes truly courageous, like Mark Twain was a really courageous example of a type 6 who went out and really did wonderful things with his literary career. But we find this courage to really stand up for yourself and know who you are and know your place in the world and go out there and make stuff happen. And that brings about their greatest hope, which is to know complete protection and guidance, which is what they've been looking for all along, and realizing that ultimate protection, guidance is coming from inside themselves, from their connection to the divine, seeing themselves as a fractal piece of the divine, whatever you want to put, whatever theology you want to put on that, it's up to you. But then they have that sort of inner security, and that brings about their sacred gift, which is divine trust. They teach the rest of us how to be more courageous, how to be more trusting, how to step into our power and our assertiveness. And then they become the money master, which is the pioneer. They're sort of the Lewis and Clark of personal finance. They're no longer stuck being paralyzed when they're money avoidant, or being a kind of puppet or pugilist when they're money anxious. They're really blazing a trail for themselves, going forth and showing us all what real courage looks like, and using their wealth and all their talents in love and service to a suffering world. Now looking at type 7, the enthusiast or the SUV. Their faux virtue is going to be mercy. Now, mercy is a good virtue. Again, all of these, but when a 7 can practice it in an unhealthy way, it means they're being too merciful to themselves, to their gluttony, to their need for to their self-indulgent desires, that need for more and more and more, that FOMO, that fear of missing out, that's got them planning always for the future. It's like, yeah, when they overindulge, they can be like, they can justify a wild shopping spree, or a wild party faster than you can say rehab and credit card debt. So be careful if you're a 7 of being a little too forgiving of your vices. Then we move into the primary recovery for virtue for a 7, which is mindfulness. Mindfulness is really about being in the present moment. It isn't just sitting in meditation, which the meditation practices are helpful for all of us. A 7, most of all, really is going to be benefit from a good daily, I would say, wake up and go to bed. Start with at least, start with 5 minutes, 10 minutes, maybe work up to 20, but get a mindfulness practice that's going to allow you to stay centered in the present moment rather than fleeing the present moment with distractions, which is a way of fleeing your pain, fleeing your anxieties, and trying to constantly distract yourself from them. Mindfulness brings you back and cures your planning, that constant need to look ahead to the future, and the gluttony that is behind it. Then we move into the greatest virtue for a type 7, which is contentment. So it's mindfulness plus generosity equals, did I miss generosity? I may have skipped that, sorry. The secondary recovery virtue then for a 7 is generosity. And what that means is they're not so worried about getting as they are about giving, right? They're flipping the script, and they're able to, instead of doing stuff, planning for themselves, planning what they're going to do next, getting more resources or opportunities, experiences, parties, whatever it is, they're a little more other focused. And that other focusedness plus mindfulness is going to allow them to really overcome their shadow structure and find contentment in the present moment, which is the thing that they've always has eluded them their whole lives. They always feel like they're not satiated. 7 never feels really satiated in some deep sense, and that could be on different levels, whether it's physical, emotional, spiritual. They're always looking for more, and when they can find contentment in the present moment, then they know complete satisfaction, which is their greatest hope. And when they can embody that, even just for brief bits, I'm not saying you're going to be living there all the time, but you're trying to live there a little bit more every day, then your sacred gift comes about, which is divine fulfillment. You embody that contentment, you embody that fulfillment with the present moment, and you then are the masters of teaching others how to do that. A good friend of mine, Henry Schuckman, is a Zen master. He's a great example of this. He really was that classic 7, just never content. When he found a great spiritual mindfulness practice, he's now one of the most humble, loving, centered, grounded people you're ever going to meet. So shout out to Henry. His book, by the way, is Original Love, just came out, which I highly recommend. 4 Inns on the Path of Awakening. Yeah, Divine Love, 4 Inns on the Path of Awakening. You want a great read, check that one out. And then when a 7 embodies that, they know complete satisfaction, they're embodying their sacred gift of divine fulfillment, they become the grounded. They're no longer the gorger or the grabber. They're really grounded in the present moment. They've got their financial house in order. They've mastered the 4 pillars of finance, which we've covered before, which is earning, saving, investing, and giving. And they're able to then really use those tools to help others feel grounded, being in the present moment, and fulfilling this, helping relieve the suffering of the world in their own unique way. Okay, we're getting there. 2 more to go. We got types 8 and type 9s. Thanks for hanging in there with me. Now, if we go to type 8, the challenger or the Hummer of ego consciousnesses, we have their faux virtue, and their enlightenment structure is going to be joy. Doesn't mean 8s shouldn't find joy in life, but what it means is that when they're having too much fun, it's a bit like watching a bull in a china shop if that bull thought that breaking things was hilarious. It tends to mean that they're indulging in their lust too much. They're indulging in sort of their vengeance too much. They're just sort of out there just sort of smashing things in a way that isn't always healthy. And so joy can, when they're unhealthy, they tend to be breaking more than they're hurting more than they're helping, as is for all of us. But they want to be careful that they aren't practicing using joy as an excuse to indulge their worst desires. Let's put it that way. Okay, primary recovery virtue then for the 8 is going to be mercy. It's being able, mercy is what's going to help them overcome that need for vengeance, that need to push against the boundaries and limitations of reality, so that 8s sort of love a good fight. And when they can embody mercy a bit more, they soften. They become a little more kind. They become a little more forgiving. They don't need to like always be up armored Humvee, and they can really then be of more, again, always being with more love and service. But when they practice mercy, that opens up their secondary recovery virtue, which is honesty. And for an 8, 8s are pretty honest most of the time anyway, but what I mean by honesty in this context is being honest about the warm, gooey, tender center that sits inside your soul, inside the heart of all 8s, which is we know it's there, but you've got it so walled off with this protective armor because you're afraid of being harmed and controlled. You're afraid that being really honest about your emotions, your feelings, your pains, your sufferings is like giving the keys of giving kryptonite to your enemies. You're exposing your weaknesses. You're exposing your vulnerabilities. But it's only in doing so and being vulnerable that you really allow people to connect with you on a much deeper, much healthier, and more authentic level. And when 8 embodies both mercy and honesty, that combines to be their superpower, which is going to be innocence. Right? They're no longer they're coming from that tender spot that really cares about justice, that really cares about inequity and cares about the suffering of the world around them, and they become this. They then fulfill their greatest hope, which is to experience complete freedom from harm and control. That doesn't mean that bad things, again, won't happen. It doesn't mean that they aren't going to be buffeted by the vicissitudes of life, but they've tapped into that inner innocence inside themselves that's able to accept things with love, able to accept that nothing can really harm or control them because they're grounded so much in their connection to the divine, to that eternal source, to their soul. And then there's a kind of infinite freedom that's possible there for all types, but especially for the 8. And that greatest hope, when they experience it, is what overcomes their greatest fear, heals their sacred wound, and allows them to become the money master, which they're called to be. And that's the dynamo. So they're no longer the detonator or the dominator. They're the dynamo, meaning they're using all of their super amounts of energy, all of their enthusiasm, all that go-get-itness, hard-charging energy is now channeled into divine justice. It's that sacred gift of divine justice is really about, like Martin Luther King Jr. was a type 8, right? We saw how much divine justice he brought through the civil rights movement. And that also required an awful lot of money and an awful lot of funding. So unless you've mastered the art of multiplying loaves and fishes, if you want to actually have a powerful impact in the world, the more money that you have at your disposal, the more power you have, and also the more time you're likely to have to really make an impactful difference in the world. So that's the type 8. Moving on to type 9, the peacemaker or the RV of egos. We've got their faux virtue, which is faith. That's their spiritual trapdoor. And for a 9, what that means, it means that they are so trusting of the universe that they think It's like, well, everything will work out. I don't need to do anything. I can just trust God, let God and let go, right? But the problem with that for a 9 is it can justify their sloth. It justifies and also their evasion of their responsibilities for stepping up into their power and really, letting their voice be heard and expressing themselves and risking the fight that it takes to really overcome conflict. So harmony is where we're trying to get the type 9 to, and harmony only comes after a fight is resolved. It isn't about suppressing conflicts, because a complete suppression of conflict means nothing ever gets solved. The problems don't get addressed. And that's what happens for the 9 if they're not careful, is they're so busy evading their problems or not speaking up or stepping into their power that their money problems causes them to be the spud or the dud. That's the fundamental reason why 9s tend not, when they struggle with money, that's often the root cause of it. So they need to not have so much, they need to not use faith as a dodge to justify their lack of action. Of course, that leads us to the primary recovery virtue for a 9, which is assertiveness. So 9s need to step up and speak up and learn how to really assert their needs and get their needs met, and not just merge with whatever the group or the individual or whatever people around them want, but be able to say, here's what I want, because and then that assertiveness, when that gets paired with their secondary recovery of virtue with modesty, leads to right action. And for modesty for a 9, again, it's much like for the type 3. It's about not overinflating your competency or sense of self, but not deflating it too much either. It's having an accurate assessment of what your strengths and weaknesses are, and not always underselling yourself, which is what a 9 tends to do. So when they have assertiveness with modesty, that's the magic formula for a 9 to embody right action. And they're the master doers. And when they embody right action, that fulfills their greatest hope, which is to experience complete wholeness and peace of mind. Now, because the 9 is so scared of asserting themselves too much that they're afraid that it's going to cause conflict, that conflict's going to trigger their anger is going to explode, they're going to rip apart, it's going to rip the people around them apart. So they never want to risk tapping into that anger. But when they're actually asserting themselves in a healthy way and combined with modesty, that right action is what allows them to get their needs fulfilled, which is what the problem that happened for the 9 in the childhood with their sacred wound is. They sort of shut off their needs because it never felt relevant. Like their needs weren't listened to by their caregivers, or there was no point to it. It was like they weren't going to be heard. They weren't able to get their own needs met because they were too young and too helpless. That creates their internalized anger. And the people around them weren't obviously doing enough to help them get their needs met, and that creates their externalized anger. But when they have right action and they're finally getting their needs truly met and standing up for themselves and grounded in their core center, that's when they experience complete wholeness and peace of mind, because they finally know who they are and they're able to stand up for themselves and really create the harmony that comes after conflicts are resolved. And that brings them to their sacred gift, which is, of course, is divine harmony. Like they're the great harmonizers of the world when they're healthy, rather than the placid peacemakers when they're unhealthy. So rather than sitting in their RV and napping all day, when they're in their shadow structure, it's like, oh no, they can now, this becomes a real utility, like a utility vehicle for positive change in the world, and they become the doer. That's the money master for the 9, the doer who gets out there and makes stuff happen in love and service to a suffering world. So that's a quick overview of the 9 Enneagram, the Enlightenment structures of the 9 types. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you found it useful, please like, subscribe, and share, and we'll talk to you next time. Take care.